A lot of my students don't like reading very much, so I have decided to read for you. I am looking at the novel Shattered. It was written by Eric Walters. Eric Walters is a Canadian who lives in Ontario. The back page. 15-year-old Ian must complete community volunteer service to pass social studies. Choosing to work at the club sounds like fun until he arrives at what turns out to be a soup kitchen for the homeless. It is here that he meets Sarge, the pipe-wielding homeless man who saved Ian from a near mugging. His real name is Jacques, and he was a soldier in the Canadian Armed Forces. His last tour of duty was as a peacekeeper stationed in Rwanda, an African nation Ian knows little about. What he learns will change Ian's view of the world and may just help Jacques too. There's a foreword written by Romeo Dallaire. He is the Lieutenant General, or was the Lieutenant General, the force commander for the United Nations mission to Rwanda. He wrote the foreword. I will read it very quickly. The foreword says, and this is Romeo Dallaire, remember, not the author. I served in the Canadian military, as did my father before me. My father was a role model for me, perhaps a little bit more stern than I would have liked, but nevertheless a man of high moral standards and example. Much of my success in life is due in no small measure to the values and principles he was able to instill in me. He was my mentor in ways military, explaining the code, military discipline, and the conduct of a non-commissioned officer. The story you are about to read is not about me, although there are similarities, but it is about a fictional soldier who has been through some of my experiences and many more. He represents a new type of veteran, released from his military family because he can no longer perform his military duties as a result of an injury sustained in operations. Had he suffered a physical injury, he would be accepted in society as an honorable veteran wounded in a foreign war. But this fellow has no visible injuries, so he is seen, as so many others like him, as just another failed soldier, gotten rid of because he is now damaged goods. It is a case that unfortunately is far too close to reality. The author has captured the frustration of the injured soldier and society's indifference to both him and the street people with whom he lives. In our own rush to material success and its rewards, we are prone to stereotype people without pausing to consider the circumstances of the less fortunate and how we can help those who have become marginalized to find some semblance of a tolerable, if not a rewarding life. The worst offense is to fail to recognize these injured people as fellow humans in our wonderfully affluent society. To belittle their condition is unpardonable. We will be looked upon by history by the way we treated our wounded and downtrodden. In this story, the reader will encounter characters who, over time, discover their own compassion toward those who are wounded. They may well be the heroes of our time. Romeo Dallaire, Ottawa, October 2005. There's a map of Rwanda on the following page. You can see Kigali is there. That's the capital of Rwanda. And we will turn the page and we will start chapter 1. I turned the collar up on my ski jacket. The wind was bitterly cold and was blowing directly into my face. It was the first day of spring, but it didn't feel like it. Instead, it was just another cold day and an endless winter of cold, snowy days. At least it wasn't snowing right now. It was the coldest winter I could remember. My father told me there was one even worse 12 years ago, but I was only 3 then and couldn't remember that far back. I looked at my watch. It was almost 10 to 6. I had just over 10 minutes to get there. It wasn't good to be late for a job interview. Then again, it was an interview for a volunteer job. What was the worst that could happen? That I wouldn't get a job that didn't pay, that I didn't want to do to begin with? Then I thought about what would happen if I didn't get the job. My civics teacher had made it clear that if I didn't get this job, she wasn't arranging another interview for me. And she'd made it equally clear that if I didn't get a placement, I couldn't pass. And my father had already told me what would happen then. If I didn't get all of my credits, there wasn't going to be any car for a birthday present. My father had promised me a car when I turned 16. That was what his father had done for him and what he had said he was going to do for me. I didn't know what type, but he'd been hinting around a BMW. It probably wouldn't be anything fancy, maybe something in the 300 series. My father could afford to buy me a Beamer. He could afford to buy a dozen Beamers. Maybe he wasn't around that much, but the money helped make up for that. Now, thinking about the car, the job interview had some real meaning. I doubled my pace. As I walked, I kept my head up, looking around. I didn't know the downtown very well at all. The times I'd come here with my parents for hockey games, shows, or shopping, and this certainly wasn't the part we'd been to. There were no theaters or fancy stores anywhere to be seen. Instead, the buildings were run down and seemed to be limited to dollar stores, pawn shops, laundromats, and check cashing stores. A couple of the stores had boards over the glass, the boards plastered with posters and advertisements. Some of them even had curtains in the windows. Failed retail had become street level apartments. The streets themselves were dirty and strewn with garbage. It was dreary and depressing, but that shouldn't have been any surprise to me. Where else would they put a soup kitchen to feed street people? I shook my head. I still couldn't believe this. I was going to be doing my community hours at a soup kitchen. That sounded like something out of a bad movie or a book by John Steinbeck. But I didn't have anybody to blame but myself. Why had I been so stupid? I hadn't bothered to read the information in the booklet listing all the volunteer jobs. I just saw the name of the program, The Club. I thought it sounded classy. I guess it did have class, the lowest class possible. Then, when my teacher told me what it really was, I couldn't back out. She'd already been on my case about how I was always taking the easiest route, how I always cut corners on assignments, and that I didn't take her class seriously. She was right. I didn't take her class, or any class, seriously. She then went on to tell me how surprised she was by my choice and that maybe she'd misjudged me. The truth was, she hadn't misjudged me. She actually made me a little uneasy. I got the feeling that she was always trying to figure everybody out. I hated people like that, especially those people who actually did have you figured out. I just wished I'd been smart enough to start my placement, any placement, when everybody else had started theirs. Somehow I just hoped I could skate by without doing it. And when she didn't mention it, week after week, I thought maybe somehow she'd forgotten about it. Now I only had 3 months to finish up what had taken other people 6 or 7 months to do. So here I was heading to the club. Obviously, somebody's idea of a joke. Unfortunately, the joke was now on me. The time was tight. It was still one block down and one block over. There was a park on my right side. If I went through the park, I could cut the angle and maybe I could just make it. I turned to the gravel path that led diagonally across the park, exactly the direction I needed to go. I'd traveled no more than a dozen steps when I had second thoughts. This wasn't the best neighborhood, and it was starting to get dark. I looked around anxiously. I didn't see anybody. I guess even bums had better places to be hanging around than a park in the cold and dark. I'd keep my head up and my eyes open and "You got a smoke to spare?" I jumped into the air, spun around, and stifled the urge to scream. There was a man standing in the shadows just off from the path. I'd walked right by him and hadn't seen him at all. So much for keeping my eyes open. The man stepped out of the shadows and into the open. My heart was still pounding, but I took a good look at him. He was dressed in a large, dirty green parka. He had a matching green toque pulled low on his forehead. a few days' growth of gray and gritty beard on his face. I didn't mean to scare you, he said apologetically. He sounded like he meant it. You didn't scare me. I was just startled. That's all, I stammered. Didn't mean to do that either. You got an extra smoke I can have? I don't smoke. Smart. Wish I didn't either. Any spare change? He asked. Sure. I unzipped my jacket and reached inside, pulling my wallet out of my pocket. I opened it up and put that away, he snapped. I looked at him, confused and a little scared. What was he talking about? What did he mean? Put that wallet back in your pocket, he ordered. But I was just trying to give you some change, I tried to explain. I understand that. I appreciate that. But you can't be waving a wallet around here. You never know who's watching. He looked stern and serious. Slowly I looked around. There were trees and bushes casting long shadows, but the park was deserted except for him and me. I don't see anybody. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they can't see you. Just put it away. I stuffed my wallet back into my pocket. You just have to be careful, he said. You never know who's around. I nodded my head. Did he really think we were being watched, or was he just crazy? I'd heard about people like this. What was the word? Paranoid. That was it, paranoid. I knew that a lot of the people who lived on the street were mentally ill, psychiatric patients, and that they heard voices in their heads, or saw things that weren't there, or believed people who were watching them were out to get them. But this guy didn't seem crazy. Then again, how did I know what was going on inside his brain? If he really was normal, would he be out here begging for change? There are people who would split your head open for a couple of bucks, and you have more than a couple of bucks. I saw the bills when you opened your wallet. I stepped back half a step. It's not me you have to worry about, he continued. There's not enough money in any wallet to make me hurt another human being. I didn't know him. He was just some street person begging smokes and change, but somehow I believed him. I think I have some change in my pocket. Not much, but some, I said. Anything you have would be appreciated, he said softly, looking down at the ground. I dug into my pocket and rummaged around. There were a few coins jingling together. I pulled them out and looked. There wasn't much. A quarter, a couple of dimes, 3 or 4 pennies. I dropped them into his outstretched hand. Thank you, he said. You're welcome. I'm sorry there isn't more. I appreciate what you gave. Some people, they don't even turn their heads. They act like you're not there. It's getting dark, he said. You shouldn't be here when it's dark. I'm just cutting through. I have an interview in. I looked down at my watch. Right now. I got to get going. I rushed off down the path. Thanks, he yelled, and I looked over my shoulder. He gave a little wave. Be careful, he called out. I nodded and kept going. Strange, not what I'd expected. A bum who was polite and well spoken. He had a trace of some sort of accent. I couldn't tell what, but something. There was also something else about him. Maybe it was the manners. I hadn't expected that. Or the way he stood. His shoulders were back, his posture perfect. Strange. With his warning to be careful, I tried to be more aware of what was around me. Coming up to a bench beside the path, I realized that it was occupied. There was a man stretched out on it. He was covered by a tattered old blanket pulled over top him so only his head was peeking out. I shifted slightly over to the other side of the path as I passed by. What a place to sleep. The guy had to be crazy, or drunk, or both.